This is the first of a series of videos that I will be recording for the Bay Area Waldorf teacher training program for the third year students who I have the privilege of joining to explore Rudolf Steiner's The Philosophy of Freedom with, starting tomorrow, March 15th. And in this first video, I'll be giving a brief, by no means exhaustive, historical introduction to Steiner's text, a brief summary of modern philosophy from Descartes up until Steiner to kind of get a sense for where Steiner is starting with this text and how it might lead to something like Waldorf education. Now, I have assigned for the first class not very much, and as the students will know, it's all in a PDF of the version that I have, which is the Michael Wilson translation, the 8th English edition. And so I've assigned the foreword by Matthew Barton, notes on the translation by Michael Wilson, and the two prefaces by Steiner, 1894 and 1918. So I'll touch a bit on those as well after the historical introduction. But first, without further ado, let's begin all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. For pre-modern Western philosophers, there was this notion that an ontic logos pervaded the world and was something that human beings participated in when they wanted to get to know the world and to become intelligent. And so it was something that wasn't just exclusively human intelligence, but intelligence in the world. And in order to get to know the world or the mind of God, one had to become adequate to that or to conform their own mind to that. But with modernity, which we could say starts, as many scholars would say, in the 15th century, there's a shift. And scholars have pointed to many different reasons for why the shift might have come about. And one way of characterizing that shift is that there was a turn to the subject, a turn to the human mind when it comes to epistemology, or the branch of philosophy which deals with how we know what we know. Someone like Rudolf Steiner or Owen Barfield after him, who both work with the conventional idea of the history of ideas, where we have like a succession of thinkers and some later on are improving on the ones before, and they're in a kind of argument across time and are somewhat treated as equals, as if someone living 500 years later is speaking in the same terms as someone 500 years before, which isn't really the case. Steiner and Barfield thought also in terms of an evolution of consciousness. And so for them, these different worldviews that get articulated by modern philosophers over the last 500 years aren't necessarily accounts of the world as it is, but may be read as expressions of an underlying evolution of consciousness. And especially for Steiner and Barfield, the modern philosophers were bringing to reflexive articulation this increasing experience of self-consciousness. The first philosopher we can start with was René Descartes, who lived between 1596 and 1650, and his famous metaphysics of dualism. You know, he famously said, "I think, therefore I am." He rooted the basis of certainty in the rational subject and excluded mind from the world. Whereas before, as I described with thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, the experience was that mind pervaded the world and wasn't just exclusively human. But now, in the 15th century with Descartes, there is this articulation of a kind of dualism, which was also a reflection of the growing success of experimental science, which suggested that there were these mechanical laws that structured the universe, and that the universe to some extent does act like a machine. And so we could say that Descartes' dualism actually reflected more of the stance one would take towards the world if you're trying to make it work for you in a certain way. So Descartes is one of those philosophers that is especially associated with the scientific revolution. So we know that there was the so-called Copernican revolution, where we shifted from a geocentric to a heliocentric model of the universe, which seemed to contradict common sense for a while for many people. And so thinkers like Galileo after Copernicus began to emphasize, as thinkers had before, that what we perceive through our senses is somewhat misleading, and that something like mathematics might be a more reliable way of getting to the truth of the outer world than what we can perceive with our senses. And so there you have someone like Descartes emphasizing that it's through the doubting rational subject that we can arrive at certainty about the external world. So we have Descartes' dualism of mind and matter already in the 15th century. And then in the same century, in the 15th century, we have the philosopher Spinoza, who lived between 1632 and 1677. And he was reacting to Descartes' dualism and articulated what he would describe as a monist perspective instead, where there's not this opposition of mind and matter, but all are one together. And as you'll see in the Philosophy of Freedom, if you haven't already read it, Steiner will be referring to both of these worldviews, dualism and monism, and he attempts to articulate a form of monism, but one that is different than Spinoza's, because the issue with Spinoza's was that the way he articulated it ended up collapsing human freedom into the determinism of nature. And so without this distinction between inside and outside, some kind of qualified distinction, the the reality of freedom becomes jeopardized. And for the philosophers after Spinoza, including Kant, this would be an issue because our ethical lives presuppose freedom. Otherwise, there would be no reason for punishment of any kind or any kind of ethical expectations if the freedom to do otherwise is just an illusion. So for Spinoza, everything follows from natural laws, the natural laws that modern scientists were beginning to discover. Human subjectivity would have been bound up with that in Spinoza's worldview, and all is just the outworking of a kind of machinic like God, and that there isn't genuine freedom, but uh, accepting the necessity of things. So he's Spinoza's worldview is what we would describe as deterministic. And then later on, this is a jumble of thinkers. We have David Hume, who Kant ends up responding to, and his radical skepticism and emphasis on what he describes as empiricism. Whereas we have Descartes emphasizing that it's knowledge is a factor of the rational human mind and innate ideas in that rational human mind. Hume thinks that all our ideas actually come from experience, come from the world. So, one of the things that Hume was famous for claiming is that causality itself, or the concept of cause and effect, which is something that we can never actually perceive with our senses, it's an idea that we bring to our senses, what we perceive with our senses. Hume would claim that this is actually a habit, it's not a reality. We never directly experience causes, we've only experienced conjunctions of things and have come to have the habit of believing in causality because of that experience. So the real issue that Hume's philosophy posed for Kant is, if something like causality just arises as a habit from our collection of experience, how can science claim any objective truth? And how does something like Newton's physics work? Why should we be able to reproduce certain scientific experiments and get the same results if causality isn't a real thing with certain parameters. So we could say that Kant comes along in 1724 and lived until 1804 and was trying to come up with a philosophical perspective that would address the seeming reality of causality demonstrated by experimental science, but also acknowledge what Hume was claiming, that causality is not something that we actually experience. And Kant was also concerned with safeguarding freedom. And so what he ends up articulating is this idea that the nature disclosed by modern science that does seem to obey certain mathematical laws is actually something that we as human beings bring to the world. So there's something about the organization of our subjectivity that presents the world to us in this way, and that's why we can know it. But we can't actually know what the world is like in and of itself. We can't know, as Kant would say, the translation into English, the thing in itself. So we have this experience of the world of appearances that our senses and the constructive activity of our mind presents to us, but we don't know what is actually behind that. We can't know that. What Kant would call the noumenal, or that which our constructive activity is interfacing with. And in addition to the noumenal thing in itself that corresponds to the world that we perceive with our senses, Kant thought that we also couldn't claim to know that we are free, but because if we could know that we were free, it would mean that we are determined, because for Kant, knowledge is just a factor of what our constructive activity, how it presents the world for us. And that's why we can know the world reliably through modern physics, because in a sense we're knowing how we put the world forth through ourselves. But in a sense, that is saying that we are not actually knowing the world as it is, but knowing the world as it is for us. And because this is how Kant defines what knowledge means, he has to limit us from being able to know that we are truly free. Because if we were to know, according to the way Kant understands what it means to know, then that would mean that our freedom is determined. And Kant was one of those philosophers who was very concerned with Spinoza's monism, because for him, freedom is essential to the ethical life, the freedom to do good or do evil, the freedom to have some kind of choice. So Steiner, of course, comes much later, but arguably Kant's philosophy continues to, even today, have a big influence, even though it's been translated into more crude terms, into more materialistic terms. For example, the idea that what we perceive is just a hallucination of our brain. And so it's couched in a more materialistic register, that our experience is just a production of our sense organs or our chemistry or what have you. We continue to be influenced by this idea that we can't get to know what reality is like in and of itself. What I haven't mentioned is that in Kant's lifetime, there were younger philosophers, referred to as the German idealists, who wanted to break through these limits, along with Goethe, break through these limits that Kant had erected between the self and the world, and between the self and our self-knowledge as free beings. This includes thinkers like Fichte, as well as Hegel, Schelling, and Goethe himself, who were trying to break through those limits that Kant had set, through the imagination in particular. And Steiner understood himself, Schiller as well, as inheriting especially the ideas of these thinkers who came after Kant. So it's with all this historical background in mind that we should understand why Steiner is concerned in the philosophy of freedom with establishing a basis in the human being for our adventures in knowing the world? What is the basis for us when it comes to confidence in knowing the world? And we can understand why he would be preoccupied with the questions that he opens the 1918 edition with in his preface when he writes, there are two fundamental questions in the life of the human soul, which everything to be discussed in this book is directed. One is it possible to find a view of the essential nature of man or the human being, such as will give us a foundation for everything else that comes to meet us, whether through life experience or through science, which we feel is otherwise not self-supporting and therefore liable to be driven by doubt and criticism into the realm of uncertainty? So, what is it in the human being that we can rely upon as a kind of solid foundation in comparison to the world of appearances, which is constantly passing away? And the other question is the human being entitled to claim for him or herself freedom of will, or is freedom a mere illusion begotten of his or her inability to recognize the threads of necessity on which his or her will, like any natural event, depends? So now with that very meager history of ideas, giving some background for Steiner's inquiry here, I want to share something from Matthew Barton's foreword that I think is helpful for anyone who feels bogged down by the abstract arguments that will be made throughout the book. Steiner calling on certain thinkers of his time, engaging them. Sometimes it might seem irrelevant, and even some of the terms that he uses to characterize these various philosophers and their positions, they could be those same terms, like, for example, metaphysical realism, as you'll see, could be defined in different ways. So I wouldn't worry too much about those philosophers' views or what, their various designations are: metaphysical realism, critical idealism, but instead just try to work with them as Steiner presents them, because as he writes, Barton quoting him from The Boundaries of Natural Science, that his primary intention in the book was to, quote, make the reader directly engage his or her thinking activity on every page. In a sense, the book is only a kind of musical score, or as I suggested in my email to you all with the PDF, a spiritual exercise that one must read with inner thought activity in order to progress as the result of one's own efforts from one thought to the next. And as Steiner continues, anyone who has really worked through this book with his own inner thinking activity and cannot confess that he has come to know himself in a part of his inner life in which he had not known himself previously has not read the philosophy of freedom properly. One should feel that one is being lifted out of one's usual thinking into one independent of the senses, so that one feels free of the conditions of physical existence. And as Barton says further down elsewhere, Steiner compares the effect of the spiritual exercise if done correctly. And I would say one has to read this multiple times in order to start to really live into that. I mean, I think upon the first reading, it's definitely possible to experience that, but don't be disappointed if that's not what you experience initially. But that it can be compared to a waking in the morning, waking out of our kind of otherwise dreamy mode of thinking. And as we'll explore, this is what one awakens to: the sense-free thinking, the self-subsistent thinking Steiner would claim to be the basis for the Waldorf approach, where the teacher is free to respond to their context in a kind of participatory way and meet each student as an individual and the class itself as a dynamically evolving reality, that you don't appeal to a rule book to teach. So, in a sense, the book could be thought of as the spiritual exercise that awakens one to that capacity in their self, and then unfolds it in ways that can't be predicted onwards. And the other thing I wanted to touch upon from Matthew Barton's great foreword is just the way in which this emphasis on thinking, as we'll see, that Steiner makes, is a kind of return to the pre-modern idea that thinking is not just something in the human, but is in the world as well. So as Barton writes, for Steiner, the sort of basis for proceeding in a confident way into life in the efforts to know the world and to respond in an ethical way in each situation without a set of rules to follow is the essence is thinking, not a subjective mode or even some kind of secretion of the brain, but thinking as an activity in which reality enters us, and the only way that it does so. Initially appearing to be bound up with our picture of oneself, our subjectivity. In fact, it transcends the self in its capacity to kindle in us universally valid concepts that are a true response to all that we perceive in our inner and outer surroundings. So, in a way, similar to pre-modern philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, but different in that there's this emphasis on the human subject self-consciousness. Barton writes, if objective reality enters us in thinking and is individualized in our subjective relationship with the world, this subjectivity has a means to engage fully with reality and to do so in a wholly self-determining way. And this again is something that we can see in the emphasis on meeting each student as an individual and fostering their own awakening to that inner guide of thinking that is uniquely theirs. Now moving on to Michael Wilson's notes on the translation. So of course you may have a different translation, and that's totally fine. It'll be great. We'll have multiple translations. Translation is a fraught project between languages. It's a miracle and perhaps a suggestion that something like the ontic logos, this principle of cosmic intelligibility, is a reality, just in the fact that we can translate across languages. But I find Michael Wilson's notes on the translation really helpful because there are certain concepts, for instance, what he translates as mental picture, but in your translation may be translated as representation, that this discussion is really important. And we'll explore what Steiner means by the term that is either translated as representation or mental picture later on in the book, but I just want to give you a sense for it now. So real quick, I'm just going to share this example, which can help to kind of illustrate what Steiner is talking about in his distinctions between the concept, the percept, and the mental picture between them. So images like these double images, at least double images, where you could see one of two things. In this image, you could see either a rabbit looking to the right or a duck looking to the left. And you can't see them simultaneously. You have to sort of switch between them. And what this shows us is that the fact that we could see it as either or, and we have to sort of intend rabbit or intend duck to see it, is that we bring our concepts, like Kant said, to our perception. So our perception is not just made of what we see through the senses or what we gather through the senses, but it's this combination of sense data or sensations and the concepts that weave those sensations into an intelligible object. So either a duck, the concept of the duck, or the rabbit. And so we never, as I mentioned, experience pure percepts because for Steiner, percepts are always illuminated or contextualized in a larger whole by concepts. And so concepts are what help us to recognize things. If we didn't have concepts, we wouldn't be able to recognize anything in this image. And the fact that you can recognize rabbit or duck suggests that you have already internalized a mental picture of a duck or a rabbit, whether it's one that is an actual living creature or an illustration of one in your past. You've internalized the concept having perceived it outside of you. And so this distinction between the concept the percept and the mental picture is that the mental picture is this modification of your own self through your earlier prior experience of having seen a duck or having seen a rabbit. You've acquired that concept, but it's being mediated in your soul life by this memory. So you could say the mental picture is this kind of in between the concept and the pure percept. And this, you could say, is also at work in Waldorf education with the emphasis on students acquiring concepts, acquiring knowledge through personal experience. You have to experience the, for example, the natural laws that we learn through modern science through actually working through the experiment rather than just reading about it abstractly. You go through the experience. And then the other translation and then the other term that Wilson translates that may be different in your version is the word for, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but tribe fighter, which would translate as mainspring. So maybe in your translation, it is, and I just read one actually, not this one, a different one, where this word was translated as spring. Wilson translates this as the driving force, and and this is distinguished by Steiner from motive. So conscious motives, as we'll see in future chapters, are that which Steiner thinks the human can rationally choose to inform our action. And so that's what allows us to be free. It's something through our thinking we can select. Whereas the word tribe fighter, however you pronounce that, my apologies, that gets translated either as spring or in this translation, driving force, is that which drives our behavior unfreely, which we're made up of motives and driving forces. So I just want to make that distinction. So you may not have drive or drives or driving force as the translation. It might be spring or something else, but of course, we'll talk about this in class. With regard to the preface from 1918, I've already read aloud the two questions, the fundamental questions that Steiner opens the book with, and with which the book is concerned throughout, divided, you could say, into based on them. Another interesting thing to mention is Steiner's claim that open-minded consideration simply of the two questions, this is him, I have indicated, which are fundamental for every kind of knowledge, leads to the view that man or the human being lives in the midst of a genuine spiritual world. This is an interesting claim. And essentially, as we'll see, it's connected with the fact that for Steiner, everything that we perceive is woven with the supersensible reality of thinking, this ontic logos that we participate in. And it harkens back to something I believe Aristotle said, that the soul is in a way all things. And so rather than materiality being what's fundamental, because thinking is what weaves things into an intelligible whole, it is really spirit that is primary, we could say, and the material world is precipitated out of it. And so to go through this exercise over and over again, in my experience, is to awaken once again to the fact that all of our experience is actually pervaded by the supersensible. We're just not aware of it. And this is according to Steiner, and I think there's something to it. One way of going through this exercise is to become aware of it. And that the whole worldview of anthroposophy could be unfolded from that activity, which is really important because if one is interested in anthroposophy, ideally, as Steiner always hoped, the practitioners of it would not just be relying on what he said, but would be activating this living thinking ourselves, this renewal of participation, and checking his work, doing spiritual research. So that's why he can claim that it seems to me that in one sense, this book occupies a position completely independent of my writings on actual spiritual scientific matters, yet in another sense, it is most intimately connected with them. The last thing I want to touch on is from the preface from the first publication, which is just remarkable. In 1894, when Steiner says, "The realms of life are many, for each one special sciences develop, but life itself is a unity, and the more deeply the sciences try to penetrate into their separate realms, the more they withdraw themselves from the vision of the world as a living whole. There must be a knowledge which seeks in the separate sciences the elements for leading man back once more to the fullness of life." So I was told that students, third year students in the Bay Area Waldorf teacher training this year have recently read The Kingdom of Childhood, in which Steiner talks about the Waldorf education method. And he's talking to I believe, English audience, and just constantly reiterating the way in which the method should start from the whole and proceed from there to the parts, and always be looking with an eye to the whole, whether it's the whole timeline of the student's life, educating not just the person that's there before you, but also the adult that they will be there, or that they will then become, giving them flexible concepts that can continue to evolve and what have you. And that Steiner here is commenting on what we could describe as the bifurcation of nature and culture. And in this book, he imagines humanity as this sort of conscious member of the kingdoms of nature, and culture as this outworking of nature itself. And science should be in the service of the flowering of humanity. And that's when we could think about what the aspiration of Waldorf education is to blossom human culture as a kind of expression of nature itself, where things like art and science aren't these sort of oppositional disciplines, but science informs ultimately the art of living, or ought to. So Steiner says, all science would be nothing but the satisfaction of idle curiosity, did it not strive to raise the value of existence for the personality of man, or humanity, the human. The sciences attain their true value only by showing the human significance of their results. The ultimate aim of the individual can never be the cultivation of a single faculty, but only the development of all the capacities that slumber within us. Knowledge has value only insofar as it contributes to the all-round development of the whole of man, or the human being. So if this book is the starting point, you could say, of what eventually unfolds as the method of Waldorf education, you could say that what ideally or aspirationally is going on in Waldorf education extends beyond the school itself, and potentially transforms society at large, and even the planet. So that's very idealistic, but if as teachers, you are trying to actualize this capacity for intuitively meeting life, and also educating young people in a way that empowers them to do that themselves, then that works out beyond the confines of the school and into the future. And I look forward to exploring this text with you these next 5 weeks, not consecutive. And look forward to questions, comments, and just being in dialogue together. So thanks for your time.